Hi, everybody. We are the panel presenters, and we've just recorded our papers for you to listen to individually. And now we've decided that we're going to record a response to the papers. And I begin with Professor Juliana Saxton. You had something you wanted to say about one of the papers.
Well, I don't, whether it's one of the papers or all of the papers. I mean, I was really interested because I thought everything connected with me talking about the risks of engagement. There seemed to be just so much in each paper that was to me very important, and I learned a lot. I was, for instance, with Danny's paper on working with the interviewees in the St. Lawrence, the relocation of the St. Lawrence River, if I can call it that, Danny. I'm not quite sure whether I'm right. And how the her interviewees were so trusting in her because she was able to tell them that she lived in that part of the country, that she too was part of their community, and how that trust seemed to generate, she felt, a different kind of sharing of those stories. I found that really interesting because in applied theater, that the building of relationships, particularly if a facilitator comes in from the outside, is something that's really, really imperative. You've got to spend time doing that. And I love that as an illustration of that kind of trust that has to be in place. And the other thing that I found really interesting was that Danny talked about how grief can shape younger generations. And I just felt that had so much to say to Bellery's work, that that we all carry the griefs and the regrets and the memories of the generations who've gone before. Sometimes we never even realize how we carry that, but it's always part of who we are. And I just found those two connections were really, really interesting. And of course, Yasmin, your whole idea of representation for me was something that made a huge impact on me. And that whole business of when does the trauma, again, this relates in a sense to what Bellery's work is, and the internally displaced people of the St. Lawrence, how close to a trauma can you get? And how far away do you have to be when you're dealing with representations of that trauma? Yeah, those are sort of the off the top kind of relationships that I discovered and found really interesting.
Thank you. Does anybody want to comment on that? Do we want to unpack that just a little bit more?
Valerie, you're nodding.
Oh, you're muted, Belle.
Yeah, I think that those are really insightful comments, Juliana. Connecting us, which is really a significant way to be thinking about the risks of applied theater. And I don't know, Danny, how you'll respond to that too, and Yasmin, in your work, the idea that you're carrying as a through line for me has to do with post-memory. The idea that we carry with us, even if we did not experience, we were not inside of that experience, but we inherit a legacy of memory that is imagined. Even imagined memory can then serve as a burden and a responsibility. And that's about witnessing. And so each of us, I think, all of us have witnessed in the work that we're doing, what it means to be witness, what it means to carry post-memory of these various events, although they're all very diverse in terms of what we've all looked at, but is, to me, an inherent part of that applied theater work that we are doing when we are dealing with individual people's histories and the larger context as well, not just the individual histories, but where they fit in the larger scale of social justice issues. So I think that's very insightful. I think this notion of post-memory, what we carry, whether it is our own experience or experiences
or somebody else's. Yeah, Rancière has quite a lot of interesting stuff to say about that in The Emancipated Spectator. Yeah.
I guess I wanted to make a connection and sort of ask Danny, have you experienced any of, like, I know that you talked about the people the river people that you interviewed, and how you seem to see with your own eyes that the generational trauma, as in even between you yourself as an interviewer, you found that you too were accessing some kind of grief, even though you were not personally there when in 1958 when the town was moved. But did you notice any of what Valerie was talking about, this whole notion of post-memory, sort of a legacy of carrying that memory, and that it bears with it both a burden and a responsibility in the people that you've interviewed?
Yes, thanks for that question, Yasmin. I would say something that I discovered was relating to what Valerie said as well, is this idea that the embodied experience is what we hold in our memories of place. And so when I walk through my town, for example, I am kind of almost pushed into those memories. And so when you are experiencing that embodied experience, and then you become aware of the histories that are associated with it, that's, I think, that's a big connection for me. And so when we bring that into the theater space, and we're able to embody those places again, like I said in my paper, we're visiting the unvisitable. And that's what I think is so significant about theater in that way. And Valerie as well, place was really, like, it was very important to you that your project on memory, that the spectators or the participants were going to that space, instead of, like, you very much said it couldn't be done online.
Well,
So I was just wondering.
I don't want it to be, because it's not at the heart of the work. Yes, you're right. You're right, Dan.
Yeah. Yes. So I was just wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit.
The significance of place, I think, is a really. I wonder also how that. I see how that works in your project. I almost want to talk about the mapping of place and the mapping of memory. We'll talk about creating spaces for remembrance. And might you, Danny, imagine doing your piece as a site-specific piece, walking the spaces of the land on which this or in relation to that land, because I don't know how close you can get to the original sites or to map the original sites. I wonder if the site-specific piece is something for you that you might imagine with your work. And then also, I think that question about place is interesting for Juliana and for Yasmin.
I really like that idea, Valerie, of a site-specific piece, because as you were talking, and as I was listening to Danny speak earlier, I wondered if, I mean, one of the things I wonder is what kind of a disconnect would one feel when they learn that their town and the memory that the inhabitants of that town is marred by dislocation. Like everybody, and as an immigrant myself, Egypt holds a very special place in my heart. And sometimes I can almost smell the sense of certain herbs and spices as I walk through the market in certain parts of Egypt. And so it holds such a special sacred space in my heart. And I don't know what that would feel like if I knew, like, I mean, I guess my question for you, Denny, is what does it feel like for you when you walk through the town knowing that this is not the original ground that it was on? Do you have what kind of a relationship is that? And then I suppose my follow-up to that is, would a site-specific piece be able to resurrect even the feelings of what the former town was like, rather than the structures of the space? So if the people that told you stories could also recount how certain places made them feel, and could that actually be created in a site-specific piece? Sorry, this is a loaded question.
That's a very big question. I would say my relationship to the community, and my community, I guess, would be that there's almost a sense of ownership of that generational passing. And so my kind of what's calling me is, well, what am I going to do now that I know the story, now that it's not silent anymore, which is a big question. And I feel as though that's something that your piece also addresses, Yasmin, is that question. What are we going to do now that we have this narrative? Whose narrative is it? And when it's your own narrative, there's a different responsibility, I think, and it's a little bit for me it's quite pressing, and there's no one else in my town doing the work and getting those stories told, really, in the same way that applied theater can do that. In terms of site specific enactment, I don't know. I would have to look into that more deeply before I could answer that fully. Yeah, but Yasmin, do you want to talk about in your work a little bit about that relationship, the relationship between responsibility of story and whose is it?
It's a really good prompt there, Danny. I've always been strangely attracted to exploring one's personal narrative. I don't know why. Perhaps I wanted a platform to discuss and make sense of my personal experiences, but I've always felt that there was so much more significance when we start from a place of I, when we own where we're at, and then we create an invitation for others to weigh in. In the case of exploring another group's narrative, I think you'd have to really weigh in the power structures that make it so that some people have more access to knowledge and means of visibility and representation than others. And you have to ask yourself, are you doing justice to these? First of all, do you have permission to delve into those narratives? And then theater has a really powerful tool to make something visible and also to perpetuate certain images that could, for instance, drive further the idea that certain people are more visible than others. And so if theater isn't careful, we may very well continue to marginalize a particular group of people who's not always visible. And so in this case, I feel that it's very difficult to blindly walk into a narrative like that and not do its justice by looking at the responsibility, who's telling the story, who's on stage, having more airtime than others, and whether the community or the people whose stories we're exploring, are they present in any way? Did they weigh in any way?
Presence can be invisible presence too. I mean, what does it mean to make present? The idea of haunting and the idea of ghosts as a methodological practice that's important for us in applied theater context, that we make visible. I talked about making spaces for remembrance. And what does that look like? What are the ethical responsibilities as you've raised? What does it mean to witness? What does it mean to witness and remember those lives? Thinking of Eve Tuck's work and Avery Gordon's work around haunting and around ghosts. But I also think the idea of witnessing is something that you've taken up, Juliana, in your thinking about the responsibilities of the audience. And I wonder how this is important to you in examining what the role of the audience is with respect to the companies that you've looked at.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because it's very much what's going on today in the world of theater. I think is it a real intensity on looking at witnesses as being particularly powerful. And as far as for me, it's not the witnessing is not as important for me in the theater as because for me in applied theater, because applied theater I don't see as being a place of witness so much as a place of representing what is happening to ourselves by ourselves. and that it's about understanding a little bit more about the world that we inhabit, and whether it's as fair for us as it is for other people. And I think a lot of our work in applied theater is helping people to understand that the world as they saw it may not necessarily be the world as it could be for them if they were a little more. So there's a really active, an action looking component of what we're doing. At the same time, I want to be really clear, this is a theater of small changes. It's not about making, suddenly everybody, stands forward and raises their arms and the protest is successful. It's about little awarenesses, little understandings, little shapings where you find that your life could possibly be different from the way it was. So witness to me has a passive component to it, and the active witness, if we say, has a different kind of sensibility to it, and more doing. I don't know whether I'm even talking any sense at all. I think it's hugely complex, and we're only just opening up these areas.
But Juliana, can you weigh in again on just the aspect of how you have negotiated that space between a performance and the audience, and how you've brought in the two texts that you were talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't even use the word performance. If I'm talking about mainstream theater, I would talk about performance. If I'm talking about postmodern, post-dramatic theater, they see what their work as performance, right? I see the work we do as very much in Nancy King's degrees of participation. I see it very much as semi-public, and that it is a presentation, not a performance. And I think doesn't mean there are less aesthetic qualities being engaged with. I don't know. The art only works as art if there is aesthetic attention paid. But I just do feel that it's performance and production are different things, and we're not involved in that in applied theater. And I would like people to be a little more understanding about that. I don't know whether that makes any sense to anyone. Yeah.
We have about 5 more minutes, a little less than 5 more minutes until our session ends.
Can you talk, Yasmin, a little bit about this idea that's been raised around with Juliana's comments around participatory practice versus, for example, witnessing? It's funny that you say that, actually, because I think of witnessing as a very participatory, active engagement in the work that I'm doing. Right? That is how it needs to have the action. I always cite zachor means in Hebrew means to act, is to remember. It's an action. So I love that you're playing and teasing out the distinctions that might be made, the layers at which we might think about it. But Yasmin, in your work, in the critique that you're doing in the work that you've seen around applied theater broadly, but in the specific context, what do you think about the acts of participation versus witnessing, both ethically in terms of performance, as Juliana has described it, performance versus production?
Presentation versus performance. Yeah.
Right, thank you. In the work that you have observed and hope that we'll unpack.
Yeah, I personally think that part of, especially within applied theater contexts, that when you do participate, you are also obligated to be a witness. And I think for me, witnessing and implication go hand in hand. And so, as you're witnessing an event or a piece of workshop theater, or you're participating in it, you are also witnessing the rest of the group. You are witnessing the event itself, so you take ownership of that. You're also witnessing and monitoring yourself. And so within that tension, then you start to say, how do I fit into this particular dynamic? How am I implicated? How do I benefit from colonial structures? How do I inadvertently contribute to the marginalization of a certain group of people? And I think witnessing is key in that. If you're not a witness to the events that are occurring in the workshop or the performance, and with applied theater, it's never just going to a performance and leaving. Typically what's unique about applied theater is that then you have an engagement with what's happening in here. And that's why what links all these presentations is that risk, because sometimes the risk is you alienate an audience. Sometimes the risk is you end up offending a group of people by appropriating their cultural ways of doing something, or appropriating something about what their community ends up doing traditionally. And so there's lots and lots of risks associated with engagement in applied theater. And I think for me, whenever I teach something in applied theater, I always start from a place of witness and implication. The witnessing allows you to be vulnerable enough and humble enough to say, I'm seeing something and I take ownership and responsibility for what I'm seeing. And I'm also implicated. And this tells me that I have something I can do.
That's part of a relational practice. That's so much that Julie Salverson talks about that relational project, I think is very central as well. And that when it's absent, when the relational has not been fully examined, that's also a problem, and that's a risk if you don't go there. But it's also a risk to develop those the foolish witness, the risking failure in making those relationships.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Paulette Reagan talks a little bit about that reciprocal process, that it can't be. I mean, Valerie, you and I have encountered that in a recent project that you and I and Julie Salverson are talking about, when Julie objected to the us and them. And the minute we start to talk about that community like that, then we're creating that divide. And Paulette Reagan, in her work with Indigenous people that are recounting their stories of the Indian residential schools, she herself said that it can't be about us studying any group of people. The reciprocity brings both stories into the narrative. And she says that that's the only way that settlers can actually reckon with the horrific atrocities that occurred in Indian residential schools.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, Juliana, final remarks.
No, I just think I think in our democratization of the theater, which I think has been going on certainly for the last 40, 50 years of my life, we have revealed all sorts of complexities, contradictions, and definitions that need to be refined, I think, in terms of what's going on in the world today. And that's the work of people like Danny, I guess, who's on the edge of I hope a sterling career in theater.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Applied theater, of course. Thank you, each of you, very much for both your presentation and for being present here for this recording. I'm just going to stop the recording right now, and then we're going to finish our chat.